Thank you all for joining us. My name is Annika Wong. I'm the Communications Director at Quivira Coalition. We are incredibly excited to offer this webinar series in partnership with the Soil Carbon Solutions Center at Colorado State University. We appreciate everyone for being here. Just wanted to go through a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you all can turn your cameras and mics off, that will help our hopefully not buffering all the time. If you have any issues with hearing the meeting or accessing the video, please contact you can contact myself. You can put it in the chat, and hopefully someone can reach out to you and help with any technical issues you may be having. We are on schedule for about an hour and a half, so we'll go from now through 12:30. Obviously, take care of your own needs. Take breaks as you see fit. We do have a scheduled break probably about halfway through this presentation, but obviously do what you need to do. We hope that you'll practice confident humility, basically this idea that we each bring wisdom and many experiences and assets to this conversation, but that we all have things to learn. I know that that is definitely the case for me in terms of this topic, so I'm excited to learn with you all. You can drop any questions in the chat. We will most likely hold those until the end at the Q&A section. And unless there's something, super burning that a presenter wants to tackle. But questions in the chat instead of raising your hand or coming off mute. That'll just help this presentation go more smoothly with fewer interruptions. I would like to do a land acknowledgement before we get started. Though we are obviously meeting virtually, we are all located on Indigenous land. I work and live on the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux, also known as Denver. Regenerative agriculture is based on Indigenous knowledge and practices. We not only want to acknowledge Indigenous land and knowledge, but also encourage folks to learn more about Indigenous history, current events, and Indigenous-led organizations where you live, and to potentially take action to support Indigenous sovereignty. Feel free to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat. Right. As I said, I work for Quivira Coalition. We are an organization that works to foster resilience on working lands, mostly within the Western United States. We do this through education and a lot of collaboration, which is part of why this coming together of Quivira and CSU's Soil Carbon Solutions Center is really awesome. We often work with ranchers, farmers, government agencies, and anybody who considers themselves a land steward. So we are incredibly excited for you all to be here to talk about this really important conversation. I'm going to hand it off to Christine.
Yes, I'm Christine Ross. I'm a research associate with the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. CSU Soil Carbon Solutions Center was founded in 2022 and leverages world-class expertise to build the tools needed to accelerate the deployment of credible soil-based climate solutions, measure their impact, and bring them to scale. The center has over 50 active members, and our team is rapidly growing. And before we introduce our presenters, it's just important to us to acknowledge that carbon markets may not be accessible or feasible for everyone. In our upcoming webinars, we'll explore creative alternatives in the second session and discuss emerging opportunities, equity, and access in our final webinar session. And for agenda today, this webinar will be around 90 minutes and will include one 5-minute break in between speakers. We will follow up the presentations with a 20-minute Q&A, and I'll be looking over the chat to share those questions with our presenters. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jane Zelikova. She's my boss and mentor, the executive director of the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. a research scientist in the Soil and Crop Sciences Department at CSU, and also a Quivera board member.
Thanks so much, Christine. Really excited to be here to kick off the webinar series with Carbon Markets 101. It'll be a little bit more than just carbon markets. We'll also talk about how we measure soil carbon. Hopefully you can walk away with some information that you didn't know already and the tools that you need to make informed decisions as you start navigating this space or are in the middle of navigating it. Next slide. So it's good to kind of have an overview of who is here. For those of you who registered, we asked a few questions about who you are. And so it looks like we have about 30% of the registrants to this webinar are actually producers, either established farmers and ranchers or beginning farmers and ranchers. But it's also interesting to see how many folks from the nonprofit or foundation sector are here. And we also have some academics and folks that are in the business sector. So it's a really interesting and vibrant mix of people. Next slide. We also wanted to know how familiar you are with the topic of carbon markets. And it looks like actually the majority of the people that are registered and attending are at least to some extent familiar with carbon markets. And a few are actually engaging with carbon market companies or pursuing a carbon project or even in contract. And only 20% or about a fifth of you are not familiar at all. So we're going to hopefully deliver content that meets everybody's needs wherever you are in your journey. Next slide. So as Christine mentioned, I'm going to briefly go over the general climate sort of opportunity or the need for us to harness agricultural lands for climate mitigation. And I'll talk about how carbon markets work. And then we'll talk about specific obstacles to scaling these carbon markets as one of the ways that we address climate change and sustainability issues. And then we'll talk about how we measure soil carbon, why it's hard, the price hurdles that we are encountering, and then we'll finish with some recommendation and next steps. Next slide, please. And just quick intro of who we are. My name is Jane. I've already been introduced. Joining me today, we have Dr. Megan Machmuller from the Department of Soil and Crop Science and co-director of INRICHES, which is the Integrated Rocky Mountain Region Innovation Center for Healthy Soils. And then Dr. John Ritten, who is a livestock economist in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at Colorado State, and also a member of AgNext and the Western SARE board member. And then Christine, who has been really the person running this whole show on the CSU side and has done an incredible job getting us all here. And then with that, we can kick off. Next slide. We are in what I would call the soils moment. There's huge interest in agricultural soil carbon and soil health more broadly, and that continues to grow from agricultural producers, nonprofits, large companies, policy people, with lots of kind of hopes that we can harness the power of soils to help us address some really big challenges from agricultural sustainability and climate mitigation to sort of helping people connect back with the land and where our food comes from. And so given all of that, we're pinning a lot of hopes on soil. Next slide. And in terms of opportunity in agriculture, globally, we use a whole lot of terrestrial land cover to grow either crops or use the land for pasture. So in this map, you can see across the globe, everything that's colored in green are areas that we use to grow crops. Everything that's in brown are areas where we graze animals, and kind of collectively taken together, that's a huge mass of land that we can potentially leverage and manage better in order to meet multiple, both sustainability and climate goals. Next slide, please. And the other thing to consider is that across this area that we've been using for agriculture, a lot of soil has already been lost. There was a paper published by John Sanderman and others in 2017 that estimated how much carbon has been lost as a result of intensification of agriculture. And you can see, again, this is a global map. Areas that are kind of orange to redder are areas that have lost a lot of carbon. And those are areas where we have an opportunity to put at least some of that carbon back by managing land in a more regenerative manner. Next slide. In terms of how much climate mitigation potential there is, with different types of land management solutions. It kind of varies, but one thing, there's a lot happening in this slide, so I'm going to walk through it in a little bit more detail. So we have forests, agricultural lands, and grasslands and wetlands. Together, we call this nature-based climate solutions or nature-based interventions. There's kind of different approaches depending on who is talking. And you can see there's quite a lot of potential with forests, including in reforestation or avoided forest conversion. And there's climate mitigation at different costs. So you can see the low-cost solutions are dark gray. The more cost-effective solutions are lighter gray, and then the white bar extends all the way out to including the more pricey solutions. So there's a cost component to this graph. And you can see that there's a lot of potential with forest management and also a lot of potential, including some low cost and cost-effective potential in agriculture, including with cover crops, deploying biochar, and doing optimal grazing, including grazing management or grazing with incorporation of legumes. And so taken together, there's quite a lot of soil organic carbon mitigation potential, somewhere upwards of 5 to 10% of the emissions associated with agriculture. No, I'm sorry, 5 to 10% of overall emissions could potentially be mitigated with managing soil carbon better. Next slide. And if we think about Career Coalition focuses on working with grazers. And so if we think about specifically grazing management and its potential to increase soil organic carbon, we can see that rotational grazing has the potential to increase soil organic carbon sequestration, as well as when it's related to not grazing or even compared to continuous grazing. And so improved grazing in general has the potential to increase soil carbon, which is interesting. It's probably context dependent, depending on where you are. The solution is maybe more effective versus less effective, but it is on the average a positive. Next slide. Okay, you can just go next slide. Okay, similarly, for those of you who are working more in croplands, you can see things like residue retention, which is related to no-till or reduced tillage practices, adding organic nutrients and deploying cover crops, all have a positive effect on soil organic carbon. So we know that different kinds of agricultural management could potentially help us sequester more carbon in our soils. Next slide. Now we get to carbon markets as a tool. And one thing that I want to note before we jump in is that there's no one type of carbon market. There is also no one type of carbon credit. So this is just a visualization of there are now 170 plus types of carbon credits that are being generated in voluntary and compliance markets. Those span from renewable energy to managing forests to agriculture, waste disposal, energy efficiency, managing chemical recycling, and then household and community projects. And so all of these different kinds of projects can generate carbon credits. Next slide. When it comes to soil carbon markets specifically, this is kind of a timeline of kind of the start of offset markets as they were envisioned in the 90s and how they've been kind of growing really rapidly over the last 8 to 10 years. So initially we had the American Carbon Registry and the Chicago Climate Exchange, and some of you in this webinar probably have some experience with Chicago Climate Exchange, which was discontinued in 2010 due to various issues that we can talk about separately. And then you can kind of see this rise of soil carbon markets starting in 2016 with the creation of SIBO and Truterra, and then Corteva and Nori started in 2018, Indigo Ag in 2019, and then just more and more companies flooding the space over the last 3 years. So this is just a rapidly growing space in terms of the companies that are participating and the kinds of programs they're standing up and the kinds of carbon credits they're generating. Next slide. And in terms of what sorts of activities in agriculture can generate carbon credits, it's not just about carbon dioxide. You can also get credits for reducing nitrous oxide emissions by doing activities around nitrogen management. You can apply biochar and get credits. You can reduce tillage, deploy cover crops, deploy biochar, start incorporating trees, so agroforestry or silvopasture. build some riparian buffers, do better wetland management, do prescribe grazing or just grazing management in general. Even solar panels on roofs of farm buildings and farm infrastructure can get you carbon credits in various programs. And then on the methane side, there are also a large number of credits that are generated through methane management and reduction of methane emissions, including manure management, anaerobic digesters, and alternative methods to growing rice can reduce methane as well. Next slide. And so all of that is happening in a really complex and growing landscape. And so it's worth kind of talking about how our carbon credit is generated. And so a farmer or a rancher is approached by someone or learns about a particular program that is asking farmers and ranchers to implement a conservation practice. And that practice is supposed to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases or facilitates the sequestration of carbon in the soil. And so the farmer then enrolls in the program, signs a contract, which we can talk about in a lot more detail later, and starts to implement the particular practices that they're getting paid for by this program. And so then the farmer is working either with a project manager or is generating data that feeds into a particular platform, which is worth kind of differentiating between what an offset market is and what an inset market is. So if activities are generating an offset, what that means is that there's a buyer outside of the industry where the credit is being generated that is actually buying that credit to apply to their own carbon ledger. So an example would be farmers reducing greenhouse gas emissions to create offsets that are then purchased by a manufacturing company or a large industrial facility that is not in the agricultural sector. Alternatively, an inset is when there is a buyer that is inside the industry. And so an example would be an input supplier that is working with the particular farmers in their supply shed, and any activities that farmers do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are applied within that sector to the input supplier. And so a farmer that's working with an offset project then essentially provides data to a project manager, and the project manager does all of the work of verifying and selling the credits to a third party. And then there's some sort of a verification process. And then once the project is verified, the credits are verified, the farmer gets paid some amount of money because the credits are sold for a particular amount of money. On the inset side, an ag corporation looks at all of the reductions across their entire supply chain and claims those reductions against their scope 3 emissions or emissions they don't directly impact. And then the credits are sold still, and the farmer still gets paid, but it's sold within the particular sector. And so next slide can show kind of a traditional carbon offset process. And so on the offset side, you have farmers that are implementing practices. You have project developers who are doing all of the compliance, including the methods and the project design. And so they're asking farmers for their data. They're asking farmers to help ensure that there are samples collected on their property, et cetera. And then the project developers are the ones that are working with the registries or the verifiers to ensure the project is verified, and then the credits are actually sold. And eventually the farmer gets paid. Next slide. And so I think it's worth kind of pausing and identifying some tension between the three main actors in this space and potential alignment or misalignment of goals and outcomes between the buyers, the sellers, and the producers, the agricultural producers themselves. And so on the buyer side, we have companies, especially on the offset side, that need to be able to buy carbon credits that have some level of permanence. Usually they're shooting for something like 100 years that is assured that the carbon removal will stay out of the atmosphere for 100 years. And then they need to be able to kind of show their stockholders, et cetera, that they have verifiable outcomes. And they're often looking for what we call charismatic credits. That means, they want to be able to showcase the project on their website and sort of tout the benefits of what they're doing. So they're often buying credits from forestry projects or agricultural projects, which tend to be the more charismatic projects. Then you have the sellers, which are often the project developers. They're just trying to sort of develop projects at the lowest cost so that they can take the kind of the higher margin on the profit, which means they're the ones that are going to be trying to minimize the rigor of the project, or alternatively try to sell it for a higher price so they can recoup their expenses. And on the producer side, we have many agricultural producers who cannot sign a 100-year binding contract, even though the buyer needs a permanence of 100 years. And there is also kind of tension between landowners and non-owner operators, people that are managing the land but don't own it, and are in the process of improving the land and potentially increasing the cost of that land for the landowner without really being able to recoup the benefits. So that's kind of the tension to the whole system that's worth keeping in mind as we continue to learn about these markets. And so with that, next slide, it's worth kind of discussing the main challenges associated with carbon markets, and that's an issue of measurement, and then permanence and durability, and tension between being able to ensure someone does something for 10 years versus buyers trying to buy things for 100 years, as well as additionality and price. And so I'll pause there and kick things over to Megan to talk about the measurement. Annika, do you want to walk through the Menti questions, or do you want me to do that? Sorry, I should probably know that.
No worries. I'm going to share the Menti questions. Leah, if you can put the Menti link in the chat. I just saw it dropped in there. So if you all can click on that, and then we will work through these questions. You can answer them and we'll see them in real time. There are a few that we'll go through. So I'll give you a few minutes here, and then we'll move to the next one. There's a question, maybe Jane, if you want to answer, what if you are the person who collects soil samples, not the person running the operation?
Yeah, so looks like 20 people say they collect soils, 15 said no. We have 120 on, but not everyone is a producer, so that makes sense. Okay, do you want to do the next question? So we're kind of interested in learning what sorts of soil analyses you get back when you send your samples in. So you should be able to click to the next question, and we can in real time see what people are getting. Lots of, well, I mean, 2 people get soil organic carbon. That makes sense. I think if you're collecting soil samples, not running the operation, if you're not getting data back, then maybe don't answer this one. All right. Looks like folks are getting soil carbon, soil health, nutrient tests, fertilizer recommendations, and a couple of folks are getting other. Okay, that's good to know. And then finally, for the folks who are managing and getting soil data back, are you using those data to make decisions about how you manage your land? It doesn't have to be about carbon, it could be about anything. We're trying to get a sense of whether or not all of the sampling is giving people the information they need to make management decisions. I guess we didn't ask if you find the data to be wholly useful or just some of the data you get back useful. It looks like most folks are making management decisions based on the data they get back. A couple of folks no, and then there's, it depends, which makes sense as well. Yeah, well, thanks so much. I'll hand it over to Megan to talk about how we measure things.
Great, thank you, Jane. Okay, there's this scribble on the slide. but that's okay. That's fine. It's art. So today I'm here to really dive into the details on how we quantify soil carbon. And in the carbon market space, we're interested in measuring soil organic carbon stocks. And I just want to start very basic here and make sure that we're all on the same page on how we quantify or calculate soil carbon stocks and what's required. There's these essential elements, one of which is soil carbon concentration or percent carbon, so the amount of carbon per gram or mass of soil. Bulk density, which is the amount of soil in a given volume, and the depth or the layer in which that soil sample was taken. And collectively, these are multiplied against one another to produce soil carbon stock estimates. And that's a amount of carbon, for example, in megagrams of carbon or tons of carbon per unit area. So for example, per hectare. So tons per hectare is often probably what you hear. And important to note here too is this coarse fragments. So we operationally define soil of anything that passes through a 2 millimeter sieve. And so rocks and coarse plant material that does not pass through the 2 millimeter sieve must be accounted for both in mass and volume and subtracted from the total mass and volume of the sample. Okay, so next slide, please. So importantly, not all soil carbon is organic, and a lot of carbon in soil, especially in arid and semi-arid systems, is inorganic. And this is a function of the underlying geology. It's the mineral carbon that is produced from the weathering of parent material. And when we're quantifying soil carbon stocks or soil organic carbon stocks, we must either we need to remove that inorganic carbon before quantifying it, or accurately measure inorganic carbon so it can be subtracted from the total, which produces the organic carbon stock as a result. So importantly, when we're talking about carbon here in carbon sequestration, we're talking about organic carbon, and inorganic carbon and must be accounted for and removed from that pool. Next slide. And let me be very clear from the get-go here. I'm going to go into a lot of different challenges today about quantifying soil carbon, but we know how to measure soil carbon. But these specific challenges, some of which I'm noting here, have hindered our scientific understanding of the true potential of soils to accrue or gain carbon. And also it's hindered our ability to manage soil for soil carbon outcomes. And these challenges, for example, include the large inherent spatial variability of soils. I mean, that's what makes soil so beautiful, all the different colors, but also it produces a lot of challenges. And especially at large scales, like in rangelands, these expansive rangelands can be even more variable. So the spatial variability and accounting for that spatial variability often means that multiple, sometimes hundreds of samples within a particular ranch, for example, need to be taken to accurately quantify soil carbon at that scale. And all of this equates to very expensive, very costly measurements given our current analytical procedures. Next slide. So in academic research, this is a typical example of a soil sampling approach that we utilize. And the goal here with soil sampling is to quantify soil carbon, is to reduce the potential sources of error in soil carbon stock estimation, accounting for that inherent spatial variability, and so that we are able to maximize the detection of soil carbon change with time. And so in research, we often use what we call a data-driven stratified soil sampling approach. Essentially, within this particular ranch parcel shown here in this map, we take all of the publicly available data to understand that heterogeneity across that ranch, and then that determines where we actually take the sample so that we're capturing all of those differences, that variability driven by several environmental factors throughout that ranch. And then within all of these locations, we might take triplicate cores down to 1 meter deep, separate those in multiple depths, sometimes 4 or 5 depths. And this particular study, this equates to thousands and thousands of dollars. So that's really not feasible in a marketplace where carbon is priced at what it is now. So next slide. So carbon market protocols vary in like 3 different categories. So you can separate them according to measurement only, so going out and taking those soil samples, modeling only, so using computer ecosystem models to estimate soil carbon change, or a hybrid of these 2. And here I'm giving you just a few examples of protocols that fall within those categories. Now, measurement only, like I mentioned, cost can be a hindrance. So that's the advantage of using models to predict and estimate change. But models by themselves are really very difficult to verify. And it's having that measurement, so that hybrid approach using measurements to verify model estimates is the most common, because you reduce the cost, because there's less frequent sampling, but then you still have that estimation of soil carbon change, which allows crediting back to the farmers in years that you're not actually taking measurements. Next slide. But ultimately the goal with all of these protocols is the ability to detect change in soil carbon. So let me take you back to the graph that Jane showed in her section of the talk, where this is a review that compiled all of the existing data that had been published from grasslands. And this is the soil carbon sequestration rate with various management practices that were deployed: improved grazing, diversity, incorporation of legumes, etc. And what you might notice is that the majority of sequestration rates with these particular management practices in grasslands fall under 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. And actually, the majority of them fall closer to the 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year. So to put this into perspective, next slide. I'm showing you here a ranch in Colorado that I've worked in. This is a spatial map of soil carbon. And what pops out initially, of course, the different colors represent the different stocks of soil carbon. So the darker red, the higher the carbon stock. And what you can first see is that indeed there is a large spatial variability in soil carbon stocks that exists within this 1,000 acre parcel of land, which is used as a grazing operation. I'm also showing you the distribution of measured soil carbon stocks in this graph. And the range of soil carbon stocks is from 2 tons per hectare all the way up past 80 tons per hectare. Now, the mean is 55 tons per hectare, and the deviation around that mean is about 30% of that mean. So when we think about measuring 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare against a background carbon stock with a mean value of 55 tons and a variability that's 30% of that, this is where the difficulty arises. Often soil carbon sequestration, or measuring soil carbon sequestration rates, is akin to finding a needle in a haystack, people say. And you can see why here, hopefully. Next slide. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that building soil carbon takes time. And this is a graph, again, showing a compilation of data from published studies, but this is in croplands throughout the United States. This is a project that Erin Prairie has worked on, a PhD student at CSU with us. And we compiled studies comparing a regenerative practice, so cropping system, to a conventional practice. And on the x-axis, any values over 0 mean that a regenerative practice led to an increase in soil carbon, and under 0 means that a regenerative practice lost carbon compared to conventional systems. the different colors here show the different length of time that study occurred in. So the darker green is studies that went on for over 10 years or more, and the lighter green is studies that were 10 years or less. And what you'll see is a good majority of studies actually showed that regenerative agricultural practices and cropping systems can actually sequester carbon. That's a good thing. But the duration matters. And that's where you see the distribution change between these different shades of green. So the longer a practice is maintained, 10 years or more, the greater chance or the greater probability of detecting a change in soil carbon stocks. So in studies that happen for over 10 years, only 6% of the studies documented a soil carbon loss, whereas studies under 10 years documented 30% of the studies showed a loss in soil carbon. So soil carbon takes time. And so when you determine to resample and measure change will be really important in your ability to detect change. And this, of course, is context dependent. Next slide. Okay, so I've kind of briefed you on the importance of, or some important considerations of field sampling, but that's only one component of soil carbon quantification is attaining the samples in a robust way. The second part of that is taking the samples back to the lab and quantifying the carbon. So in this particular project, we asked, is there consistency among testing facilities for the quantification of soil carbon? And so in this particular study, we sent a set of samples, the same samples, to 8 different external testing labs, common labs utilized by people in the US. And it was five different soils, and each of those soils was divided into 2. One was sent wet, so like fresh from the field, and one was dried in our lab and then sent. So with that, we're testing the internal lab variability among receiving a sample that was just freshly collected versus one that had already been dried. So we're testing both within lab variability and across lab variability. And we asked for reports on the total carbon concentration, the organic carbon concentration, and the inorganic carbon concentration. Next slide. And what we found was actually quite astonishing. And these 2 graphs are showing the different colors are the different labs that we sent them to, including our CSU research lab. And this is showing the concentrations that were reported for organic carbon concentration on the left and inorganic carbon concentration on the right in those 5 different soils. And again, remember, we sent both a field fresh or wet soil and a dried soil to each lab, and each of these labs received the same soils. So the first thing to note is that there's an extremely high variability among labs. So if you're looking at the lowest number for organic carbon concentration, for example, on the left panel, 2% was a value that was reported by one lab versus close to 5% for another lab. So that's nearly a difference of 3% carbon that was reported just by different labs. And the inorganic carbon variability is even greater, a 5% difference, meaning an absolute difference. So 1 to 6% difference in carbon concentrations that were reported between labs. We also see that within lab, just there's variability just by sending just dependent on the state of the sample, whether it was sent as wet or already dried. And so this is really important to consider if you're utilizing different lab facilities and trying to compare those results to one another. This is something that is critical. And it really drives home the point of standardizing soil processing and analytical procedures, which vary widely among these labs, which is probably driving this variability seen here. Next slide. Okay, and so this is an analysis that Jane put together a few years back, and this is the different carbon market protocols, various protocols that are being utilized, and she ranked them according to rigor, additionality, durability, and safeguards. So I'm talking about a very specific aspect of the quantification of soil carbon today, which is, of course, is important to consider. But there's other aspects such as additionality, how we account for additionality, durability, and other safeguards that John will actually get into later after the break today. And so just note here, that's very obvious from this graph, that not all carbon market quantification protocols are made equal. Next slide. And right here, potentially to save on time, I'll just leave this key takeaway slide up for you to digest while we take a break, and leave it at that, and then turn it over to John at the end. And if you have any questions, hopefully we'll be able to address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Okay, everyone, we'll take a 5-minute break. And if everyone could join back around 11:47. Thanks.
Is it time to get going again? Looking at Christine or Annika?
Yes, sorry, John was reading the chat. Whenever you're ready, yeah, take it away.
Fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It looks like we have people from diverse locations here. As Jane mentioned, I'm an economist, and so I tend to look at things, these sort of incentives through a financial lens and really look at, challenges and opportunities associated with carbon credits. And so next, please. Again, as Jane mentioned, there's 170 plus types of carbon credits out there now, or offsets. And so agriculture is really a pretty small subset of the overall carbon finance picture. And so what we focus on is really how do we get more sequestration to occur? Again, from a buyer's perspective, what they want is more carbon sequestered than would have happened in the absence of these instruments. And so how do we actually do that from an agricultural perspective? I'm going to focus more on the grazing side and really looking at implications of adaptive grazing management and how that works. You can go ahead and hit next twice if you would, please. And so, like, what is additional, right? What do we mean by additionality? Again, as Jane pointed out very well in the beginning, is this has to be something that would not have occurred in the absence of carbon finance and is also not required by law. Again, from the buyer's perspective, if I'm going to claim this on my ledger or as an inset for my scope 3 emissions, it has to be above and beyond business as usual, or else I'm not really getting anything for my payment. So hit it one more time, please. And so when you look at, I saw a couple comments in the chat, when you're comparing different contracts or projects, really focus on how they define additionality, because the requirements to prove additionality to the buyer really vary a lot by the different projects and programs out there today. So next, please. One of the other big challenges with carbon markets is permanence, right? And so again, from a buyer's perspective, if I do in fact incentivize you to sequester more carbon on your land, how do I know that's going to be there in 5 or 10, hopefully 100 or 1,000 years? Really, the definition of permanence is probably about 1,000 years. Most of the markets want something in 100 years is more valuable than something that's shorter. Go ahead, next, please. From a grazing land perspective, right, one way we know that either slows down sequestration or can in fact turn rangelands into a carbon source rather than a sink is drought. So this is, again, just last spring, a large area of the grazing lands in the United States was in drought, right? And so not only are we not actively sequestering carbon, we're probably actually losing some carbon in that time frame. Another big risk, next please, is fire, right? And so this is the Great Basin area, right? And so mean fire probability, there's some geographic impacts of where you are and how likely your land is to burn. And again, anytime that we have one of these natural events, such as a fire or a drought, we know that we lose some carbon. And so next, please. As a land manager, how willing are we to ensure we keep the carbon that we do sequester in the land, and over what time frame? And from a buyer, what assurance do we get? Right. So contracts, again, vary. Projects vary. Again, buyers are looking for probably a minimum of 100 years. Some of these projects can be 15 or 20-year minimums. But again, if we even sign a 5-year agreement with a 10-year storage contract on the end of it, we've agreed to manage the land for 15, 20, 40, 100 years, depending on the project, to ensure that carbon stays underground. One more next, please. And so this is a lot of the way this is done in many contracts is an insurance pool or a buffer, right? So this is, they hold certain credits back every year and don't sell those as a buffer against either non-attainment, is called, or a shortfall. Some contracts say, right, is that at the end of the 5 or 10-year contract, or the additional 10 or 20-year storage period beyond that, if that carbon still isn't in the ground, they're gonna not sell those remaining credits for you. So next, please. A couple more challenges with these is again, even a 5-year contract with a 10-year storage period at the end of it, you have to control the land for that entirety of the contract. And so it's not as difficult if you're a landowner, but again, if you're coming on to retirement age, right, and you sell your land or you transfer it to the next generation, those new landowners have to agree to those same sort of management practices that keep that soil underground. Another challenge is on leased land. And so I have seen some contracts that allow a lessee to enroll in a project, but you need to have the landowner co-sign and then agree to manage that land with whatever practice was agreed upon in the contract for the entirety of that, again, contract and storage period. And so if that is a landlord a lessee sort of scenario, then it's a bit of a bind, because now you're at the discretion of that landowner to continue to lease the land to you, even though, again, as I think Jane and Megan both pointed out, that we may have made that land more valuable through some of these practices by increasing soil health over time. One more, please. Another is federal land issues, also state land issues. And so this varies across the West, specifically with state lands, is whether or not you can enroll public lands and who gets, right, the credits that are generated, whether offsets or insets, and who do the payments accrue to. That's something, again, anytime I'm looking at one of these contracts, I highly recommend having an attorney look at it with you or for you, because there are some nuances in the way that federal lands specifically are treated in these contracts, since most of the financial benefits would actually accrue to the U.S. Treasury. Next, please. Prices are all over. Go ahead, next. This is the 2022 prices for most of the major registries. We're looking at offsets primarily here. Go ahead and hit next, please. The top 5 are probably the ones that most of the ag lands that we're talking about today would fit into. And again, they vary by the volume of credits issued, as well as the prices, but the prices are not all that compelling, right? And so when we analyze the average price for credits that were tied to agricultural land management, in 2022, the average was only $4.31 per metric ton. So next, please. So we've done some analysis, and I'm going to use an older example here just because there is so much diversity in the stipulations of the current projects and contracts. This is actually based on the old Chicago Climate Exchange protocols. And so we have aggregator fees or project developer fees, right? So this one is 10% of the gross. A lot of contracts now actually have a percent of the net or the gross, it depends. Verification fees, here we have a fixed per land area verification fee. And so the CCX was really a model-based market. So on the right-hand side of what Megan presented earlier. So some contracts now that are more outcome-based, right, or measurement-based, it really can have a pretty severe financial impact on the outcomes as to who pays for the soil test, whether that's the landowner or the project developer. We have a simple 20% per credit trading fee, and then a reserve pool here at 20%, but I assume that we have full compliance and we sell them all. Some of the management fees are actually upwards of $1.50 or $2 per acre now per year. And so these are really conservative costs. And I'm just going to run through like what that looks like. So if you can hit next 3 times, I think, there we go. Using an average price of $4.31, assuming no loss, right? So we actually accrue 27 hundredths of a ton per acre per year over 5-year contract. That averages to about 89 cents per acre per year, right? And so if you think about that quarter of a ton per acre per year, that was probably right about in the middle of some of those slides that both Jane and Megan talked about, which may actually be a little bit optimistic for a lot of the Western United States. That was what the Chicago Climate Exchange benefit was, or their accrual rate was modeled to be. And I think that has shown to be a bit of an overestimate for a lot of the grazing lands in the Western United States. We've also modeled this at a higher rate. And so you can hit next, please. That this is 2/3 of a ton per acre per year. And again, we don't have any drought. We don't have any fires. So we accumulate 2/3 of a ton per acre per year over 5 years. The revenue payments, again, based on these conservative cost estimates from the CCX, would be just over $2 per acre per year. Now, there are markets with higher prices. We also ran this through the current California prices of about $30 per metric ton. That turns into about $7 an acre in terms of revenue. But anytime that I have a producer that looks at this, you know, the things I really want to know in that contract is what's the cost of aggregation. So that project developer, how much do they need in order? They can't do this for free. They have costs as well. So what are their costs? What's the cost of trading? If it's an offset versus an onset, there's different requirements. And then verification is probably one of the biggest wild cards out there. Again, is this simply a modeling exercise, or are we doing measurement or a hybrid? And if we are doing measurement, who's paying the costs of those soil tests? Next, please. I just ran this through, again, being at Colorado State University, we get a lot of interest in this. And so this is, again, going back to how realistic is that 1/4 of a ton per acre per year, going through the Comet Planner module hosted here at CSU. just kind of picked 4 counties in different parts of the state of Colorado and expectations for carbon sequestration for using a rotational management as opposed to continuous grazing. None of the expectations are even as high as what the CCX estimated, and CCX estimated again that 0.27 tons per acre per year for basically eastern Colorado. And so some places we may actually lose carbon over time. So again, it's really important to know what the potential is for your geography and climate, and then whether the project is simply a measurement, so getting verification of practices, or if it is a verification of outcomes, because there is some risk of non-attainment in this as well. Next, please. We actually looked at what it would cost. Some of the best management practices that are recommended for grazing lands is adaptive management. And so we actually have a study with ARS just northeast of Fort Collins here out in Nunn, Colorado. And so we did 2 different kind of economic models, was to put in a rotational mechanism. So either subdividing a large pasture and increasing stock density, and it was adaptively managed. We actually did this on site. So forage utilization was one of the triggers, animal health or animal movements was one of the triggers. We also looked at precipitation, real-time precipitation, soil moisture. So we adaptively managed these lands with a 10x stock density. So we looked at either putting permanent barbed wire fence to subdivide this. We used electric fence, and then scenario 4 versus 5 down there is dispersed pastures. And then we just actually moved animals around. And so the cost of the infrastructure and labor, so again, ignoring the revenue side, it's anywhere from $0.50 to almost $4 per acre per year. This is an annualized cost over the lifetime of those investments. So next, please. Graphically, what this looks like is the left-hand side. So that large continuous is kind of our status quo. And then those next 2 are the subdivided large pasture with an adaptive management program. And then those 2 on the far right is our multi-pasture, either continuous or adaptively managed rotation. And so we have pretty severe increases in infrastructure costs, specifically if we put permanent fencing in that large pasture. Next, please. The problem was it wasn't just increased costs in order to put in a rotational grazing system. We actually had 12 to 16% decreased animal performance, right? And so we actually reduced revenue on average of about $1.34 an acre over the lifetime of this original experiment. So next, please. So this is just that continuous or that large pasture that was subdivided. The dark green is our continuous season long. This is the returns to infrastructure and labor. So this doesn't include management or land fees, anything like that. It's just the infrastructure and labor, because those are the only differences in the treatments. In all years, you can see that continuous season long grazing resulted in higher animal productivity as well as higher revenues. And we did account for the price slide, which is why in 2017, it looks like the systems are pretty equivalent. That was just an odd market phenomenon year where we had a really distinct price slide. So the lighter weight animals in that adaptively managed system actually received a much higher price per pound. And so we've actually done this through 21 now. I just didn't include the graph here, but it's still about 10 to 13% decrease in revenues each year, which impacts the bottom line for any rancher that's considering this. So go one more time, if you would, please. The way I talk about this with producers is this is the cost of achieving additionality, right? So if I am currently doing a continuous season long rotation, I need to implement some sort of change in order to meet the buyer's requirements of additionality. Now, again, that's kind of the intent of these programs and projects. What the actual requirements are vary from project developer to project developer. So look at what's going to be required to make that happen. But again, we're going to give up either in terms of lost revenue and or increased cost $2 to $5 per acre in order to do an adaptive management in Northeast Colorado. Again, we did this on the ground and measure actual costs. And then the revenues are probably about 80 to 90 cents per acre per year. And again, if we assume that we're only going to get about 2/10 of a metric ton rather than a quarter of a ton, we're probably in that 50 to 60 cents per acre in revenue. And so it's not necessarily going to pencil out from a strictly financial point of view. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, because again, some of those contracts don't require the same level of additionality, and this might be a practice you wanted to implement anyways. And so even getting some of those costs of conversion covered is important. And one thing I will state though, again, this is assuming a 5-year contract, we get paid for 5 years, but then we still have these additional costs of $2 to $5 per acre for the next 10 or 20 years for the storage period beyond that. So there's a bit of a misalignment in when the revenues come in and then how long those costs are expected, because we have to continue to maintain that land for the permanence aspect of it. And so with that, I think I will pass it off.
We're gonna do some more Menti questions here. Leah, if you can put the link one more time in the chat so that we have that at our fingertips. We'll go to the next question here. And that is this one right here, ready to go.
All right.
The link is in the chat.
Thanks. So question one, are you, for producers or land managers, are you participating in a carbon or ecosystem services marketplace or a soil health program where you get some sort of a benefit, even if it's like technical assistance or education or financial? Yeah, looks like most folks are not currently participating. A few folks are. That's good. For the folks who are participating, so that's a few of you, are you getting paid for outcomes or for practice implementation? Meaning, are people measuring the particular outcome, be that water quality, soil health, soil carbon, nitrogen, or just based on you implementing a certain set of practices like rotational grazing or cover crops or wetland restoration or something like that? All right. Looks like folks are getting more folks are getting paid for implementing practices. That makes sense because that's a bit easier. And then for the folks who are getting paid, how much are you getting paid per acre? And we sort of have them in broader bins of $1 to $5 per acre, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, or more than 20. Great. All right. Depends on the practice. All right. Looks like most folks, a small sample size. The scientist in me would say this is too small of a sample size to draw conclusions from, but looks like folks are getting paid anywhere from 1 to 5 and 6 to 10. Very few, no one's getting paid more than $20 an acre, which makes sense. But these 1 to 5 and 6 to 10 are similar to what you might be getting from a government program. So that's good. Okay, well, let's wrap up so we have time for questions. I'm just going to wrap up by just showing you this graphic. And if you haven't seen this before, it's worth just blurring your eyes and looking at it for a second. This was developed in 2023 to give an overview of all the different entities that are currently participating in a carbon market. And so we have folks on the left in gray. These are buyers of carbon credits or carbon offsets. Folks on the right are working with the supply side, either developing projects, working directly with land managers, et cetera. And then you have everything in the blue in the middle, which is the biggest sort of space and volume. And these are all of your standards, registries, measurement companies, exchanges, traders, brokers, people that are tokenizing credits and putting them on the blockchain. Various entities stood up to help govern this whole wild, wild west landscape. Companies that are providing crediting ratings for various carbon credits. So you can see the majority of the action is actually in the middle. And these are entities that get some sort of a cut from every transaction. And so you can kind of see like a lot of the finances that are going into this space are actually going to stand up this middle area, which is all of these various trading broker registry companies. And that's kind of where the bulk of the money is going. Next slide. There's a report that kind of highlights, I put it in the chat, all the different registries that are issuing credits in soil carbon. These are just a few of the soil carbon programs that exist today. And one thing to note about them is that they vary. And so there were a lot of questions in the chat about various programs and how they operate. One thing to note is that there's just a lot of variation in the space, and depending on the project developer or the company, they vary in the kinds of practices that they cover and issue credits for, the kinds of protocols they use, the registries they put their projects on, and the program details, including how many acres you need to have in order to enroll, how long you have to stay in the program, so like the length of contracts, and also I will say the permanence that's required, meaning how long you have to keep your practices in place. Next slide. And if we look at the number of projects currently registered or undergoing verification in the voluntary registry offset database, there are 65 soil carbon projects currently sort of either registered or going through verification. And next slide. On top of that, 43 are under development. So that's over 100 projects that are in the pipeline or about to sort of start selling credits, which is a lot of projects that cover a lot of acres. Next slide. And in terms of how we think about the quality of a carbon credit, and this is to help answer some of the questions that were in the chat about the climate benefit, we look at certain criteria to assess the quality of the carbon removal activities like soil carbon sequestration. And those are additionality, as John talked about, measurement or carbon accounting, as Megan talked about. We also think about harms and benefits, whether the projects are generating any additional ecological benefits or benefits to the community. The Microsoft worked with Carbon Direct to develop essentially these criteria. And when they evaluate projects, which Microsoft does in a public way, they evaluate using these specific criteria, also about climate justice and environmental justice, and the durability in terms of how long carbon sequestration is assured to be maintained. And then leakage, meaning if you implement a certain set of activities in one project, if it leads to something outside of the project area that actually can cause climate harm. So an example is I might conserve a plot of land for forests. And so that conservation activity would mean no deforestation on that land, but that would mean there would be deforestation somewhere else as a result of that activity, and that's called leakage. And so from a soil carbon projects perspective, most of these projects have strong ecological benefits, but then there are questions about who benefits financially, and especially tension between landowners and non-owner operators who are creating additional value for the land. There's usually little climate justice or environmental justice downside, but one area that we're going to touch upon in webinar 4 is uneven participation and the continued exclusion of underrepresented minorities in these projects. Next slide. And so as Megan mentioned, I spent 3 months and significant amount of brain damage reading all of the soil carbon crediting protocols in 2021 and evaluated them based on rigor, meeting additionality criteria, meeting durability criteria, and safeguards, meaning sort of community and ecological safeguards, and then gave them a rating. And just one thing to note from this, and I put a link in the chat, very few of these protocols, which essentially outline how a credit is generated, had met even like basic rigor. And the few that were pretty rigorous, one was an Australia project or Australia protocol that's part of their compliance or regulatory mechanism. And then a few other protocols that actually are not used to generate credits today. So moving forward, next slide. It's also important to consider how farmers and ranchers think about these opportunities. And this was a study published a couple of years ago that looked at, essentially asked farmers what they think. 90% of folks were aware of carbon markets, but very, very few are currently participating. And the majority said they wouldn't participate without significant changes to how these programs operate. They also noted that the amount that they get paid per acre is very important, which makes sense, as is the ability to get credit for pre-existing practices, or as another way to put it, being able for early adopters to be able to participate. And also there's a pretty heavy paperwork burden to participate in these programs. And so a lot of folks noted that they wanted that to be decreased. Next slide. And so from a paper that just came out last year that did a survey of farmers. Farmers expressed concerns about convoluted, burdensome, and unpredictable nature of receiving offset credits and emphasized that they were implementing practices for their own business interests and sustainability concerns, not the financial incentive of the generation of carbon credits. Which makes sense if we think about the data that John presented, where the payments are actually pretty low and may not be worth participation in and of themselves. And next slide, in the same study, the authors noted that carbon offset payments for agricultural soil carbon sequestration are largely reaching farmers who are already implementing these beneficial practices or already strongly interested in implementing them. And then the payments for offset credits are seen as gravy on top, suggesting that these offset markets face strong challenges in terms of additionality. And certainly this meets some of the questions that have been in the chat. So next slide. We have, in the last, I don't know, hour and 15 minutes, we've given you a lot to think about, but we have some general recommendations for producers who are navigating this space or for technical assistance providers who are helping producers with this. Number one is ask a lot of questions. Certainly this group is very good at asking questions if the chat is any indication. And then the other big thing is to compare between programs. A lot of farmers and ranchers are getting multiple knocks on the door from different programs. And so it's worth understanding how they differ in terms of price and program rules and total contract lengths. So if the project is supposed to be in place for 10 years, but the project developer is assuring buyers 100-year permanence, what does that mean in terms of how long a producer is on the hook? And then who is paying for soil sampling? Many programs require at least some form of soil sampling, but it's really important to understand who's going to pay for that. And then in terms of risk, you really have to understand the opportunity cost of participating in future programs versus participating in a program now. And so if you sign up for a program now, you might not be eligible for a program in the future. And then this is something that probably John could talk about in a lot more detail, but non-attainment risk and also a risk of data ownership. So when you sign a contract with particular companies, you're handing over the rights to your data in a way that it may make sense, but it might not. And the company can certainly monetize those data outside of your permission. So it's worth asking questions about that. And so next slide, I just kind of want to wrap and say, from the Soil Carbon Solutions Center perspective, I just want to thank everybody that's part of our center. We're growing. A lot of the folks that are pictured here are doing either fundamental or applied research in the area that informs how carbon markets are scaling today, including sort of coming up with the data and the models that can hopefully help improve how we quantify carbon benefits. And so I just want to thank everybody that contributes to this work at CSU and beyond. And then next slide, we'll definitely have time for questions, but we just want to say we're available. If you have any follow-up questions, please get in touch with John, Megan, and I, and we're happy to continue engage in this conversation. We're trying to develop resources for producers and get really involved in this space as it's growing in a sometimes very concerning speed without a lot of checks and balances from the outside. So I'll pause there. I'm sure there are many, many questions. If you want to do next slide. Next slide, Annika. There we go. Thank you.
I think we have time to do one question right now, and then we'll probably do the survey real quick. So Jane, Megan, and John, how could we address the issue of additionality for early adopters? Are there other ways for them to get paid for their practices?
I think maybe this could be a good John question to start.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the tension that Jane talked about early on, right? Is from a buyer perspective, if you've already adopted it, then we've already sequestered that carbon. I can't claim additionality. Some of these projects do allow some look back years, right? So it could be 2, 3, 5 years in the past, they'll pay you for that those practices you already adopt. But again, from a buyer's perspective, they really, if they want to decrease the carbon on their ledger, they want more, right? Which is problematic for the market because a lot of the good producers out there already have a lot of carbon. So we talked about this on a webinar a couple of weeks back with ARS, is that once your bucket's full, it's hard to get more carbon. And so we have a lot of land out there that may not be able to sequester more based on soil type and climate. So this is something that the market's going to have to work through. But I really think since the power balance is on the buyer side, and since we're in a voluntary market, it's going to be really hard to get people to be paid for existing practices because of the need for additionality when we make these claims that we've decreased our carbon footprint.
Thanks, John. Megan or Jane, do you want to add anything else?
I think that covers additionality is just a really challenging, from a climate perspective, it makes sense. You want the activities to actually sort of provide climate benefit. And so rather than like getting mad at additionality as the requirement, we have to really think about what is the particular system meant to deliver and whether the system we're deploying is the right system for the job. Which is a question we should really be asking ourselves. Our carbon market's the right tool to help us address climate change, which many people in the chat also had the same question.
Thanks, Jane. I think one more question that I pulled from the chat. What does our soil results mean for the efficacy of soil management approaches and markets as a mechanism?
Sorry, one more time.
What do our soil results mean for the efficacy of soil management approaches, different soil management approaches, and markets as a mechanism?
Yeah, so maybe this is a question that's reflecting Megan's results that show that the way that we process soils in the labs that we use and the procedures they use give us really different results, which I would say undermines probably the whole endeavor and the credibility of potential sort of market mechanisms, but it also depends on how big of a problem this is. So maybe this is something Megan can talk about.
Yeah. It's important to kind of put this into the context in which we are working in, and the existing soil testing facilities and why they came to be. And initially, or most commonly, soil testing facilities are used to test nutrient concentrations for fertilizer recommendations. They were not built to or focused on soil carbon. And, and for fertility measurements, removing the rocks and roots is of less importance, right? Because we're not concerned about the accuracy or precision of that measurement, and it's good enough to understand the trajectory of how you're building your soil health, or your soil health is changing, or how much inherent nitrogen is left over from the following cropping year, for example. And so, I mean, it's certainly astonishing to see that variability, but it's not to say that we can't measure it well. And we know how to do that, but it's about creating the system and the checks and balances and the certification or protocols, making sure that that there's a piece of education there. Basically publishing or making available what we think are the most rigorous soil carbon processing protocols, because much of that variability comes in the sieving step. And a lot of testing facilities will grind before they sieve, or grind while they sieve. And that, of course, grinds plant material and rock material, which, of course, have very drastically different ends of the spectrum in terms of carbon concentrations, which then can contribute to that variability. So I think we can certainly get there. Again, also, studies like what I showed, the results today, I mean, we weren't really we have our specific research protocols that we follow. But in terms of searching or actually quantifying that variability that exists among testing facilities has never been done before, because now that there's enormous interest in this rapidly evolving carbon market space, where the quantification of carbon that's being traded, especially being used for offsets in terms of climate mitigation, where it becomes really, really important. And so that's what we were set out to do. And so I think once this is, there's a level of learning and education and checks and balances that is required to happen, but we can certainly get there. I don't know, I kind of went on a tangent there, but
no, thank you so much,
my two
Megan.
cents.
I'll jump in real quick too, just from the financial perspective, right? Is I think anytime we talk about financial markets, right, we want confidence in the certainty of our outcomes, right? And so we're willing to pay for that certainty. And so anytime we have uncertainty in markets, right, confidence in what we're buying diminishes, and that can have a downward impact on prices, right? And so if we go all the way back to kind of the core of the carbon markets, if it really is a true cap and trade system, we have two businesses that pollute, and we as economies say that we're going to decrease pollution by some percent overall. If it's cheaper for one operation to decrease pollution by more than that percent, they could sell that decreased pollution right to the over emitter. And so we have very high confidence that we've in fact decreased pollution if we have monitors at smokestacks. But when it comes to these agricultural lands, that's one reason that prices are not as high as a lot of us would like, because we don't have as much certainty. And so anytime that we throw more uncertainty into the additionality and permanence, it's going to keep downward pressure on prices. And so that's, I think, the longer term implications for these markets is we need to overcome this uncertainty if we do want people to get paid revenue stream that's compelling to adopt change.
Right. Totally agree. And I just want to make one point that I wasn't able to make during my section. There's a lot of emerging technologies in the quantification of soil carbon. Our models are always improving with the more data that we obtain, that we can use to parameterize and improve those estimates for models. There's spectroscopy that can be utilized to measure soil carbon. That is an emerging technology that would significantly reduce the cost. And so as the markets are rapidly evolving, so are the technologies and quantification methods and protocols and models. And so I think in terms of the costs on the measurement side and the verification side, I think that can only go down with the improvement of these technologies and measurements, and with the improvements in models in our predictions. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear, that there is a lot of opportunity in this space, and it's improving.
Thank you so much, Megan. Annika, do you want to switch to our survey real quick to fill out the Menti? Annika, do you want to share these slides?
Should say too, if you stay on.
Yeah, if you can, if you're still on, we'd really appreciate getting some of your feedback on the webinar. The link is in the chat again. If you can pop into that, just gives us some good information about who you are and how this first part of this series has gone, and then Jane and John can stay on a few minutes. Hopefully, maybe that will work. We can take a few more questions. I'll give you a few minutes here to maybe fill out this question. We've got a few more survey questions, so I'll run through this pretty quickly. A few more people. All right, and then I'll go to the next one, and you can continue to fill those. What questions remain unanswered? All right. Couple in there. Great questions.
I very much worry about the exploitation piece.
All right, looks like still some coming in, so we'll leave that open. Christine, I don't know how we feel about running over. Just offer that up to your team.
Well, I think if folks have more questions and need John or Megan and I to stick around, I can stick around for a bit, but it's already been an hour and a half and it's a beautiful day outside here in Colorado. So thanks for joining. Please get in touch if you have questions. I already saw a couple of emails come in from folks that were in the webinar. We're here, we want to help. We know this is a really confusing space and we need to have all the information to make good decisions here. So we appreciate you joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks. A recording of this webinar is going to be sent out to all the registrants, along with an annotated bibliography of all of the citations and references that the three speakers spoke about today. And I just want to thank everyone who attended today and to all three of our wonderful speakers, along with Leah and Annika and the Quivera team who helped plan this event. And we have 3 more webinars following, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah.
Annika, do you want to go to the last slide or say anything else?
Nothing from my end. I'll go ahead and stick on for a few more minutes to see if there are any last minute questions, and if not, we'll stop the recording and then close the webinar. So we can awkwardly sit in silence for 2 more minutes. If anybody else has anything that they want to chat about, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Looks like most people are taking Jane's advice of going outside.
So gorgeous.
Yeah,
Well, can I ask just one final question?
sure.
When you talk about biochar addition to rotational grazing practices, what kind of application rates are necessary to get a significant soil carbon change?
Wow, that's a loaded question, and it's a great question, and I've heard that question many times. I'll just briefly say, and I know this is going to probably be disappointing as an answer, but it really, well, biochar is almost all carbon, right? And so so the question is how much additional carbon would be accrued besides just the carbon that, due to the biochar being added. So the way that would happen is if biochar enhanced productivity, for example, and carbon inputs to the system, or reduced decomposition and loss, for example. And so adding, the biochar carbon that you're adding, of course, is carbon that you're adding to the system. But the question is how much additional carbon beyond that can you stimulate to accrue within the system? But that answer there widely varies. And I don't think there's no one answer. Like many of these, like you can ask a similar question for grazing and rotational grazing, and that number also widely varies, and it's totally context dependent. But in order to accrue that additional carbon, the context, the environmental factors, the climate, for example, that promote highly productive systems will likely be, give you your best opportunity to start to build biological carbon as a result.
Yeah, it is disappointing because the range is so high.
I know.
Let me ask it this way. Is there, I've seen reports as much as 800 pounds per acre. Is there any view that just a few pounds per acre causes that additionality of biochar?
I mean, the additionality, so there's two ways to think about additionality. From a climate perspective, it's all about this word counterfactual, like what would have happened to that biomass if it hadn't been created into biochar. And then from a additional carbon sequestration perspective, it depends on the ecosystem in which it's being applied. And there are some instances where actually, you know, adding a small amount across a really large expanse is like really meaningful, and you don't need to add, you know, a lot of biochar to get a lot of bang for your buck. But I mean, realistically, it probably isn't as effective in dryland ecosystems as it is in wetter ecosystems, just because there's more carbon in the soil in wetter ecosystems. But that's a very broad kind of brush to paint with. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, if
I put
there,
my favorite
Thanks.
biochar paper in the chat if you want to read about biochar.
thank you, Jane and Megan and John. I think that it's time for us to log out, and hopefully we'll see everybody next Tuesday.